Hi everyone. Before we start today, I'd like to take this time to recognize that we are currently on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe nations, which was acknowledged in the Dishwit One Spoon Wampum Belt. That wampum uses symbolism of a dish to represent the territory and one spoon to represent that of the people that are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. I'd also like to thank Indigenous Studies and especially more particularly Vanessa for helping us organize this event and provide their wonderful outdoor teaching space. Now, Liz and I met in 2015 at the University of Pennsylvania, where we were both postdoctoral fellows. She joined our research center during my second year, and we instantly became mortal enemies on the tennis court. Coming out of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she worked with Dr. Kathleen Duval, we all knew that Liz was a great historian. Our director, Dan Richter, was ecstatic to tell us about this new postdoc that was going to join our institute. And we heard all about her groundbreaking work on the Petites Nations, a group of smaller indigenous polities that preserved their land and communities in Louisiana and Mississippi. What we didn't know was that this new postdoc was also a political activist fighting for indigenous rights. Having only known her for a few months at a time, we only knew Liz Ellis, the historian. Then, in April 2016, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests began at Standing Rock, and to many of us, this was the first time that we got to see Liz Ellis, the political activist. Liz galvanized support for Standing Rock in Philadelphia, leading the charge and inspiring crowds all over Philly. She became the sassy face of the movement in Philadelphia. One of our colleagues actually referred to her as, and I quote, Jessica Jones kicking ass. It is my immense pleasure to introduce, all the way from New York University, Dr. Elizabeth Ellis.
Thank you so much to Max for that somewhat overgenerous introduction. I am delighted to be here this afternoon, and I want to say thank you so much to the Wilson Institute, to the Indigenous Studies program here for bringing me this afternoon to talk a little bit about Standing Rock, roughly 1 year after the height of the conflict. I also am grateful as an uninvited guest on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people to be here this afternoon. So yes, there is oil in the Dakota Access Pipeline, and yes, there is little legal recourse left for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. But there's also a fire burning in the heart of Indigenous America, and it has ignited a generation of activists and forged solidarity on a scale we have never seen before in the United States. Just over a year ago, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe captured the attention of the world as they took on a global oil corporation and the federal government on the American Great Plains. As you will likely recall, in 2015, Energy Transfer Partners, the company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline, announced plans to run an oil pipeline through Standing Rock Sioux treaty lands, over sacred sites and burial grounds, under the reservoir that provides this reservation's primary source of drinking water, and to build a pipeline against the reiterated wishes of the Standing Rock and Cheyenne River Sioux. In 2016, this conflict reached a fever pitch as tens of thousands of people traveled to Standing Rock Sioux territory to defend Standing Rock lands and stage a massive demonstration against the pipeline. For more than 6 months, water protectors camped on the plains and rallied the American public to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline until the Trump administration approved the final permits and enabled the pipeline's completion in spring of 2017. So this afternoon, I'm grateful to get to speak to you about a few of the broader implications of this conflict, roughly 1 year out. I'll be speaking mostly about the resonance of this conflict beyond Standing Rock and how the fight over native water rights turned into a broadly intersectional movement. I'll speak briefly about the constellation of issues that I think made the fight at Standing Rock resonate with so many communities, and then I'll explain why I think we are at a crucial junction and why I think some of the most critical work happening now is focused on pushing conversations about Indigenous sovereignty both in the US and in Canada. Ultimately, the No DAPL, No Dakota Access Pipeline movement built a platform that has funneled Indigenous energy and dialogue, not just into fights to protect Native resources, but also into using Indigenous perspectives and histories to critique systems of exploitation and oppression within the US at large. Now first, just to cover again the fight over the Dakota Access Pipeline itself. So there are many, many problems with this project. There were many, many protests and issues raised by the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. I'm just going to run through a couple of the core ones here and not go into detail. I'm happy to talk in further detail in the Q&A about any part of this. So first of all, the Dakota Access Pipeline crosses the Missouri River in the United States, which currently supplies drinking water for 18 million Americans and so threatens to jeopardize this resource. The permitting process of this pipeline was highly irregular. It subverted national regulatory practices that are designed to mandate environmental reviews for projects of this size and scale. And the CEO of Energy Transfer Partners, again, the company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline, donated more than 100,000 American dollars to the Trump and Republican campaigns during the 2016 election year. So in late 2016, the Obama administration, because the Dakota Access Pipeline movement spanned 2 American presidencies, the Obama administration, in response to public pressure, mandated a full environmental impact statement. So this is a governmental initiative designed to assess the possible damage of these kinds of large-scale construction projects. But then in January, as soon as Trump took office, he reversed the Obama administration's mandate to conduct a full environmental review and halt construction, and instead signed an executive order in January that avoided the environmental impact statement report altogether. Moreover, private security forces as well as U.S. police and military unleashed tremendous violence on unarmed Native people and their allies. If you recall, this includes everything from, there was a lot of coverage of the dog attacks when private security forces unleashed German shepherds against Native people in September, and the use of water cannon against water protectors in sub-zero temperatures. And this was the incident at Backwater Bridge last November, where Indigenous water protectors were caught on a bridge for hours under water cannon, and a young woman, a non-Indigenous woman from Brooklyn, had her arm mostly blown off by a tear gas canister. So throughout last fall, police fired rubber bullets, beanbags, tear gas, and sound cannon into unarmed Indigenous people, and water protectors regularly confronted tanks, drones, and heavily militarized police. By the conclusion of the conflict, more than 700 people had been arrested, and there were disturbing reports that some of these activists were held in dog kennels, subjected to unlawful strip searches, and charged with felony crimes, so higher than the misdemeanor crime, which would be usually what you might get charged with in the States for a protest action, for their participation in these protests. Moreover, the state of North Dakota, where the Standing Rock Sioux Territory is falls within the bounds of the North Dakota state, borrowed $28 million from the state bank to fund police and supplies to respond to these peaceful demonstrations, thereby footing the North Dakota taxpayers with this bill for this private oil corporation's project. So, like I said, these are just a couple of the issues with this pipeline, and I can talk more about any of the specifics of this later. But basically, the key takeaway here is that both the state and federal government bent and subverted regulations designed to protect American citizens and American lands in order to support a private oil company, and that the government was also willing to use brutal force against Native peoples to facilitate the completion of this project. So ultimately, the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a government agency that's responsible for administering federally controlled lands, like a lot of Native territories, gave the permits to build this pipeline. And the state and federal government did supply the military force necessary to remove water protectors from this route. And so despite the objection of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and the opposition of hundreds of other Native nations within the U.S., the federal government enabled the completion of this pipeline. So the devastating conclusion to this conflict has left many Americans asking, did all of this effort make a difference? Are Native battles unwinnable? And in light of our current political moment, especially in the U.S., does the fight at Standing Rock still matter? The answer is yes. Yes. years, and more than most of us could possibly have imagined a year ago. The fight matters because it was the most recent chapter in a centuries-old saga of American colonial violence against Native people. It matters because it illuminated the willingness of the federal government to bend and sidestep regulations designed to protect the environment and Native Americans. But it also matters because the movement demonstrated that with the support of non-Native allies, Native people could force the federal government to change policy and practice. It matters because it propelled modern Native people into the public consciousness, and it matters because this conflict built the largest pan-Indigenous alliance in North American history. As Dr. Dagenet mentioned at the beginning of this, I usually work in the 17th and 18th century, and in the US we celebrate Pontiac's Wars, this massive pan-Indigenous resistance movement, the greatest of all time. And I used to teach this as a thing that my students would always ask, why didn't Native people band together to take on the government? And I sort of said there are a lot of differences, this is a variety of nations, that could never happen. I was very wrong. At its height, the pan-Indigenous backing for Pontiac was about 20 nations and 3,500 people. Standing Rock has more than 360 Native nations backing them, and upwards of 12,000 Native people and Indigenous allied people who came out to Standing Rock physically to support the Standing Rock Sioux. These allies include Indigenous people from South and Central America, Australia, the Pacific Islands, and the Arctic North. These nations understood that the pipeline represented a critical threat to Indigenous sovereignty and resources, and that the oil industry in the US, and certainly in Canada as well, has long facilitated violence against Native women. In the US, this is remarkable because the support included groups like the Crow, who depend on coal extraction, and my own nation, the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, many of whom have personal and economic ties and investments to the Oklahoma and Texas oil industries. So the support of these nations came not just from Native people's sense of an obligation to honor and protect all of our relations, and here I mean all of our relations both in the human and non-human relative sense, so mountains, fish, animals, all kinds of forces that depend on the river for their survival. This could be, broadly considered as Indigenous environmentalism, but also from a sense of the critical importance of supporting Native people's rights to determine what can be done with their territories and their resources. So if this immense coalition of Native people is unprecedented, so too is the broad support from non-Indigenous allies. The Standing Rock Sioux received support from a series of very unexpected places. This group of non-Indigenous allies, which was composed substantially of concerned Americans, included faith organizations and leaders, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, environmental activists, and ultimately some American veterans. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe received support from Black Lives Matter activists who have been fighting to provide clean drinking water to Flint, Michigan, and to stop police violence in the US for years. Perhaps more surprisingly, support from a couple thousand of American veterans provided crucial leverage to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. In late November, as violence escalated on the plains, the federal government demanded that water protectors, the folks out at these camps, remove from Standing Rock Sioux territory by early November, and they threatened to remove them by force if they didn't remove voluntarily. In the midst of driving winds and snow, 2,000 veterans traveled to Standing Rock and offered to put their bodies on the line between the water protectors and government forces, merely days after they showed up and offered to front Native people in their quest to protect their lands. The federal government rescinded this. They told Native people they could stay, and the Obama administration issued a formal order for a full environmental impact statement, so that thing that the regulations was supposed to do in the first place. And everyone celebrated, tentatively, but this was a massive victory. Altogether, estimates suggest that from 12, and possibly some people have estimated it as high as 20,000 people, physically journeyed to Standing Rock to defend the lands, and tens of thousands more took to the streets and cities across the country and pressured their representatives to take action to halt this pipeline and the ongoing violence against Native people. Last year, I was working at the University of Pennsylvania and living in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is in the state of Pennsylvania in the US. It's 44% African American, 45% white, and 7% Asian. Less than 1% of the city identifies as Indigenous or Native American, And the state of Pennsylvania has no Indian nations that have formal relationships with the US government. So despite having a minimal visibility of Native people, Philadelphia, like so many other American cities, had a strong solidarity movement to support Standing Rock. And this was the image of one of our rallies in September that was on the poster for this event. In fact, the organizers of Philly with Standing Rock were primarily non-Indigenous people. They were Euro-American settlers who had long been committed to environmental justice, or Black community organizers who were working on issues of environmental justice as well. And then there were a couple of folks of Central, South American, and Caribbean backgrounds who were of Indigenous descent, who were anti-colonial advocates. Most of the folks in this group had absolutely no experience working with Native American nations or communities and were deeply unfamiliar with Native American law and history. But this didn't seem to matter, and they worked tirelessly to advocate for the Standing Rock Sioux and to engage the Philadelphia public on this issue. So my experience with Philly with Standing Rock got me thinking, what made Standing Rock work? How was it that this movement gained so much traction and managed to enfold all of these folks with no background in Native rights issues? So first and foremost, this movement was built on the passion and tireless commitment of Native men, women, and youth who poured their hearts into organizing. There were the women of Standing Rock, like LaDonna Birbal Allard, the Oglala Lakota activist who invited people to come camp on her land and initiated the prayer camps at Standing Rock. Before these camps, in spring of 2016, 20-year-old Bobby Jean Threelegs, a young woman from Standing Rock, initiated a tribal youth run to Washington, D.C., and she and Standing Rock youth ran all the way from North Dakota to Washington, D.C. as a relay run. This took weeks and weeks to deliver a letter to the federal government to ask to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. There was the national or indigenous organizations who backed the Standing Rock Sioux, like Winona LaDuke and Honor the Earth, and Candy Mossett and the Indigenous Environmental Network. There was Native activists, academics, and professionals like the tirelessly working lawyers of the Lakota People's Law Project who provided legal support for water protectors who had been arrested. And then there were the folks on the ground, like Jules Rich, a mother who advocates against meth on the Pine Ridge Reservation, who physically locked her body to a piece of construction equipment to prevent the day's work. We should also not forget that the Standing Rock Sioux are the descendants of Crazy Horse, of Red Cloud, and of Sitting Bull, who fought the federal government at the Battle of Greasy Grass, better known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, in 1876, where Allied Lakota, Dakota, and Cheyenne forces defeated American forces in a stunning military victory. More recently, in 1973, Oglala Lakota activist Russell Means and members of the American Indian movement from many nations seized the town of Wounded Knee, the site of an 1890 massacre of 150 Lakotas. And together, this coalition of Native folks from across the country held Wounded Knee for 71 days as they withstood FBI bullets, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so a government entity, and blockades, and called on the federal government to demand that they honor the Sioux Nation's treaty rights. So the Sioux Nation is what was Lakota and Dakota people's formal political organization in the 19th century. So in effect, Lakota and Dakota peoples have a long legacy of fighting to defend their people and homelands. But this passion alone does not explain this success, nor does it explain why Standing Rock was such a monumental movement. At its height, the encampment at Wounded Knee involved 200 people, and again, there were upwards of 12,000 at Standing Rock. Instead, we should recognize that the resonance of this movement is also the result of an expertly crafted and disseminated messaging of the No DAPL movement. Most Americans, U.S. citizens, are not familiar with the contours of Indian law. I know this is not a term used in Canada, that's the formal term for the legal strictures in the U.S. Unless they live in a state like Oklahoma or Montana with a high Native population, they have minimal interaction with Native people in their daily lives. And even 5 years ago, there was rarely coverage of Indigenous people in the media beyond the occasional expose about drug use on reservations. In the U.S., Native and Indigenous people are only about 2% of the population, and we do not have an APTN, and there are minimal public discussions of Native policy in the federal government. But we do have Hollywood, and we have lots of Westerns, and we have Disney and Pocahontas. So to the extent that the U.S. and Americans think about Native people, They frequently envision Native people on horseback in war bonnets, and they're probably familiar with the Battle of Little Bighorn. And they've seen images for sure of Pocahontas singing to raccoons and painting with all the colors of the wind. So what Standing Rock did so expertly was to draw on these images and stereotypes. If we think about how so much of the early movement was couched, we think of the rally cries: water is life, water is sacred, honor the earth, defend the sacred. The demonstrations and encampments were presented as rights to pray, rights to defend the graves of Lakota people's ancestors, and Native people's commitment to land and water. I do not mean to suggest by any measure that this was not sincere, or that the Standing Rock movement did not launch a cultural and religious revitalization of Native Americans on a level that we have not seen in more than a century. It certainly did. But this was also a move of tactical brilliance because the messaging drew on assumptions and stereotypes that Americans were already familiar with. And it couched the conflict on grounds of environmental and religious justice in ways that were comprehensible to all Americans. Coupled with this, the movement built on the strategies of Idle No More and Black Lives Matter and used social media to disseminate the message. The use of Twitter, Facebook Live, and other platforms let Native peoples tell and frame their own stories. What it also meant was that Native people could present themselves to the world as modern, normal humans, as young men and women wearing t-shirts and jeans, shower slides, or snow boots, and it provided America with a glimpse of the tremendous diversity of Native people. On these live feeds and through Native curated interviews, Americans saw Native people of all skin colors, including those of us who are black passing and white passing, and with all kinds of hair, tattoos, and accents. I know some of this sounds very silly, but it was really the first time in the US there was mass coverage of Native people like this, and so it exposed Americans to a new concept of Indigenous identity for the 21st century. Much of the early coverage of this movement was sympathetic, but it was also rather problematic. If the early news stories ran tragic reports on the bulldozing of Lakota grave sites and energy transfer projects, private security firm setting attack dogs on unarmed Native people, they also focused almost exclusively on tropes of ecological Indians and defense of a way of life. The first major story run by the New York Times covering the movement in August explained that the fight was a major environmental and cultural threat. While certainly both cultural and environmental factors were central tenets to this fight, this also missed a crucial component of the issue: Native sovereignty. When we consider the media coverage of Standing Rock from last fall, we can begin to see a transition by about November to stories that increasingly headline issues of Native sovereignty in addition to environmental and spiritual concerns. This transition was in part fueled by a dialogue of Native peoples on the front lines, but also by an effort by some of the water protectors that forced these issues into public attention. In late October, water protectors set up camps in the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline as it was being constructed on the treaty borders that the Sioux Nation had negotiated with the federal government in 1851, effectively reclaiming these treaty lands, arguing that this was their rightful territory, and they refused to move from the highways along these borders. This action helped flip the script and center the public discussion on the issue of treaty rights and sovereignty. Non-Native Americans seem to struggle to grapple with this, and as we can see from the news coverage that non-Indigenous Americans had more trouble with this narrative. In early November, the New York Post ran an article that was broadly sympathetic to the Standing Rock Sioux, and that argued that Native people ought to be couching their rights to prayer and clean water in their rights as American citizens. As author Naomi Schaefer Riley claimed, tribes aren't sovereign nations, and the U.S. decided this 100 years ago. Native people would beg to differ on this point, and the legal code certainly doesn't reflect Riley's claims. But I think the argument is a perfect representation of how Americans struggled to understand the fight over the Dakota Access Pipeline as a fight for Native sovereignty rather than a fight for environmental or spiritual rights. Again, this was where the ability of Native people to control the narrative via social media became so essential, as activists like Lakota lawyer Chase Iron Eyes took to Facebook to explain treaty rights, and the American public was exposed to a dialogue that many of them were deeply unfamiliar with. and this was a critical turning point. Essentially, the point here is that we can conceptualize of the no-DAPL dispute as a contest over the rights of Indigenous people within the U.S. to clean drinking water and to the protection of the graves of their ancestors and to pray, or we can conceptualize this as a fight between nations over a territory and a struggle to force the more powerful United States to honor its international accord with the Sioux Nation. Lakota and Dakota people have some of the clearest land claims of all Native people in the U.S. Unlike so many Native nations in the U.S., the Sioux were not relocated across the country. My own family started in what's currently Illinois and has ended up in Oklahoma, possessing none of the territory they originally had. And while they were starved and corralled on reservations, the fact that the descendants of the Sioux Nation maintained land bases in their original homelands means that the modern Sioux reservations look a lot like clean, clear, bordered nation states, which is the model of sovereignty we're most comfortable with in the 21st century. So I mentioned this 1851 treaty earlier. This was a treaty of the Sioux Nation, so Lakota and Dakota people, signed with the federal government, the first treaty. Effectively, the U.S. government came to the Arapaho, Arikara, Assiniboine, Cheyenne, Crow, Hidatsa, Mandan, and Sioux in this year begging for an alliance. Gold had just been discovered in California on the west coast of the U.S., and settlers were streaming across Plains Nation's territory in an effort to get there. They were also getting assaulted by Native people who, understood this to be a violation of their sovereignty. And so the federal government went to the Sioux Nation and said, can we work out an alliance? In exchange for their promise to, make sure that Americans got through their territory safely, they promised to safeguard their borders, develop trade, and to protect basically the Sioux from any white settlers coming through. During the 1860s then, Americans discovered gold in the Black Hills within Sioux territory, and the federal government didn't uphold their promises of the Treaty of 1851. Effectively, when the Sioux refused to sign away the Black Hills to the federal government, the state waged a brutal war of attrition until the Sioux finally signed a new agreement in 1868. This was the era of the Little Bighorn victory, but after the American Civil War, the federal government really consolidated its military power in a very powerful way, and so military opposition was no longer an option. Anyway, this is important because the Sioux, although the Sioux were forced onto smaller land parcels, they never signed away the title to the Black Hills. And in 1980, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the U.S., found that the government was guilty of illegal land theft, and the U.S. offered the Sioux $15 million as a settlement. The Sioux, who were possessed some of the most impoverished counties in all of the United States, rejected the $15 million, which means in effect their land claims and the findings that this land is rightfully theirs is an ongoing and open case. Likewise, even after the U.S. broke the 1851 treaty and renegotiated territorial claims in 1868, this subsequent Fort Laramie Treaty continued to recognize the land where the Dakota Access Pipeline was built explicitly as unceded Indian territory. If that wasn't enough, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1908 that Native nations retain water rights on their territories, meaning if a water flows onto Native people's territory, even if it's outside of their technical land, they have a right to decide what happens to that water source. So in effect, it's rare in the U.S. that treaty rights are as crystal clear as this. But the Sioux Nation unquestionably has rights to this territory. And so the Dakota Access Pipeline fight is largely about Native sovereignty and international treaties. In effect, what the public discussion of Standing Rock did was to open a national discussion of Native sovereignty in the U.S. and to pose the question, what will the sovereignty of Native nations look like in the 21st century? Now, for more than a century, Native people have been arguing for the U.S. to honor its treaties and to respect the rights of self-determination of tribes. It's worth noting here that U.S. treaties with Native people were made prior to full incorporation of these nations in the U.S., as Native peoples did not receive citizenship from the federal government until 1924. And many nations, like many of the Mohawks, rejected citizenship, insisting that they could not be simply forced into the U.S., but were sovereign nations. One Mohawk leader in 1924 articulated this as the same thing as the U.S. passing a law to say that Mexicans were now U.S. citizens. Within academia, over the last decade, scholars of Native law and history have been pushing to theorize the origins of Native sovereignty, and this work has produced really fruitful discussions, but it's largely stayed in academia until this point. For example, Kevin Brunel, a professor of politics at Babson College, has argued that the issue of Native sovereignty is that the colonial process has created what he calls a third space of sovereignty, which leaves Native peoples caught between being fully autonomous nations and being part of the federal government. Tribal courts in the U.S. are hamstrung with restrictions. They can't try non-Indigenous people, with very slim exceptions on some reservations for people who commit acts of domestic violence or sexual assault. There are limitations on the kinds of punishments that tribal courts can inflict on people who are found guilty within courts. There are maximum prison sentences that I think are a couple of years at most, and maximum fines that I think are no more than $10,000. And this legal morass facilitates violence against Native peoples and property. More recently, in 2014, Stephen Wheatley, a law professor at Lancaster University, critiqued the UN's Indigenous Peoples Framework. And I know Canada has just adopted this and is in the process of negotiating what nation-to-nation relationships will look like. And his critique is based on the premise that what the framing of Indigenous peoples does is to construct Indigenous people only in opposition to the state and colonial experience, and to frame their rights as rights for self-determination and self-government rather than autonomy and independence. This past winter, David Nichols, a historian of early America and Native American history, published a piece designed for popular consumption, arguing that we must understand Standing Rock as a fight over Native sovereignty, in which he argued that the modern understanding of sovereignty began in early modern Europe with the creation of nation states and international political recognition, so the ability of other nations to recognize nations as nations, creating sovereignty. And that the long record of U.S. borders with Native nations, as well as treaties that clarified self-government and jurisdictional boundaries, means that Native nations are just that, modern nations. As Nichols so beautifully put it, the goal of the No DAPL movement is not merely to stop the construction of a potentially dangerous pipeline, but to spotlight the obligations of the United States to the sovereign Great Sioux Nation, to respect their lands and not foul their water. This discussion of sovereignty is so critical because it's the platform by which the No DAPL movement, which received broad support from the American public, has grown into a movement that facilitates the critique of American U.S. racism and oppression based on Indigenous sovereignty. So what I mean here is last winter, when Trump unveiled his Muslim ban, which stopped immigrants from 7 primarily Muslim countries, refugees, being allowed to travel to the U.S., Indigenous activists led by Lakota activist Nick Estes and Navajo activist Melanie Yazzie began the rallying cry of #NoBanOnStolenLand. The critique here is pretty self-evident, suggesting that since the U.S. is constructed on stolen Indigenous territories, the federal government has no right to decide who can and cannot possess and belong to this land. This argument has been revived more recently as Trump has attempted to end the deferred action for childhood arrivals. You may have heard of this as DACA, or the Dreamers disputes in the states, which basically says kids that grew up in the U.S. can have a period of deferment and not be deported mid-being in college. It allows them to work. It gives them papers. Last spring, as Trump promised to build his border wall on the border of Mexico, Tohono O'odham tribal chairman announced that only over his dead body would Trump build his border wall. The Tohono O'odham have territory, community, and family on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, and so again are using these critiques, this Indigenous sovereignty, to critique the U.S. imperial project. And then more recently, as in the U.S., we begin a conversation about Confederate memorials and monuments, which many in the states view as monuments to white supremacy. These are monuments to the Confederacy, which attempted to secede from the U.S. in the second half of the 19th century so that they could preserve slavery within their nation. And there are many, many monuments across all of America to this movement. And so as Black Lives Matter and other activists have critiqued these monuments, Indigenous people have stepped up and supported activists, but have also use this discussion to frame a discussion about our upcoming, a lot of cities in the States still celebrate Columbus Day. A lot of museums still present Indigenous people in very problematic ways. And in the Southwest, a lot of places still glorify the Spanish entrada into Pueblo territory. So if, in effect then, the public discussion of Native sovereignty that was created by the No Dakota Access Pipeline movement has led to a broad Indigenous critique of current U.S. policy and created a public platform and presence for Native peoples unlike any we have had historically. So it's perhaps too early to, recognize the full impact of this movement, but the closest corollary I can find is the post-Wounded Knee era. Again, this was this 1970s occupation of the site of the Wounded Knee massacre by American Indian movement activists. While the federal government ultimately dismantled the American Indian movement's resistance at Wounded Knee, the activism of the 1970s forced critical shifts in federal policy towards Native peoples. Over the next decade, the federal government passed bills to support education for Native youth, permit Native people to practice their religions, to keep Indigenous children within their families and nations rather than being adopted out to white parents, and to allow Native nations rather than the U.S. to administer federal assistance and healthcare programs. And it seems that we're in a corollary moment now, but with the advantage of a much larger and more diverse movement comprised of 360 allied Indigenous nations and hundreds of thousands of non-Native allies. Therefore, as we consider the legacy and the outcomes of the No DAPL fight, it is perhaps better to conceive of this movement not as at its conclusion, but at its beginning. Newe, thank you. So I think the question was, how do we as historians use and expose social media properly? Is that right? Yeah, I think that social media has done absolute wonders for Native peoples, especially within the U.S. Again, I not to over-glorify it in Canada, but there really isn't the same kind of public representation in the States. And so for even as deeply problematic as it is, social media has done so much. I mean, within the States, we still have the Washington football team that's known by the R word, and that was not on the public consciousness until social media. I think the question about how do we as historians use this responsibly is something that I think we as a field are still trying to figure out, right? Does one tweet, can you use that as evidence of popular sentiment? Is this really just pulling the worst of the internet and people who didn't have access to voices before? I think that I think it's completely legit to look at things that are trending and use that as a way to reflect national consciousness, right? The kinds of things that, we're talking about again and again. I think where it can be both really helpful and really tricky. I remember sitting in my office. Well, I probably shouldn't say I was in my office, but I was in my office at the McNeil Center watching the live feeds of what was happening at Standing Rock and really struggling because it wasn't a formal news source. I couldn't quite understand in a lot of cases what was going on exactly. You could see violence, but it was all taken out of context. And so I think a lot of that in the moment of the movement was really hard to put together, and it took until folks came back because there were reception problems. Meaning, I think a lot of people said their phones were intentionally scrambled. They had no access to Wi-Fi. But basically, it was kind of a, more like my time period where it takes a couple of weeks for people to get back and report on what was actually happening on the ground. I remember calling friends of mine who are out there saying, what is it we're supposed to be doing now? What's the message coming out of Standing Rock because of the diversity and the diffusion of messages? So I think as historians, I think the further we get from this, the clearer we'll see it, but I think it's an absolutely valid, and we do what we can with the sources we've got, so yeah. So the question was about the Truth and Reconciliation program in Canada and whether I think that that's a helpful thing, if that would be helpful for the US, and whether that's productive. I think a lot of people, I would be hesitant to over-glorify, right? Truth and reconciliation sounds beautiful. I think we're all looking to see words into practice and to see what that sort of means on the ground. But I do think the fact that there's a public consciousness of this is just so huge. In the US, we're still fighting for against the idea that Native people have died out, that we don't exist anymore, and that the article I cited, it's not even the sort of like your nation. So much of what was great and what was problematic about the Standing Rock movement was that a lot of people became enlisted in this because of environmental concerns and because they feel bad for Native people, which is great, but it doesn't help you kind of understand and see Native people and let them voice their own sets of concerns. Like there are things that are very problematic, right, about Save the Standing Rock Sioux. And so I think having a truth and reconciliation sort of discussion in the US would be monumental, would be super helpful. But there are also just things that are really fundamentally different in terms of policy. Like I was talking about tribal courts in the US, which is, I think, not a thing that you all have in Canada. And I think there's just differences in the way that the legal processes work in really substantive ways. But I do think, especially in the connections that have been built now is the time to ask questions like that and to sort of work together and say, okay, as Native nations, building international alliances to other Native nations, what is it that we can do and how can we collectively press our governments or the governments that claim to control our territory to respect us as mutual nations? So good question. So the question is, how can historians encourage people to look towards the present and the future and try and avoid stuff like the American Indian movement, where the actions at Alcatraz and the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs end up as pages in textbooks that we don't hold. I think a lot of this, right, is the sort of basic public education things, which is so much of the root of the issues that I'm talking about in the States, where a lot of times in U.S. history textbooks, we have Native people that pop up when the Pilgrims show up, and they pop up during Indian removal, and they pop up during the Plains Wars, and then we handled it, no more Native folks. And so I think writing for public audiences is really crucial. I think historians engaging with the public and using sort of things that might not seem to be, in the same way that I was talking about here about our immigration debates within the states and our debates over public monuments, those are entry points to add your voice to a chorus of other voices calling for social justice, but to frame it in ways that remind people that Native people are still here and use Indigenous critiques to critique. I think your question is great, because so often we think about the American Indian movement as a failure, right? As this thing that falls apart. Leonard Peltier is still in jail and has been for decades and decades for basically trumped up and questionable murder charges. He was a leader of the American Indian movement in the U.S. And I think that, like I said, I think that we underestimate the impact that this had. I think if you look at what Indigenous people were grappling with in the 1960s and the kinds of policies they were dealing with, and then you look at the post-American Indian movement era, the ways, not to over-glorify the federal government, but the way that this movement put pressure on policy is huge. And I think we need to stop looking in the same way at Standing Rock and say, okay, the Dakota Access Pipeline is built, end of story, is to look at the way that the conversation has changed, look at the kinds of pressure, hopefully, right, in probably the best possible scenarios, that the next corporation that would like to exploit Indigenous resources looks at this and thinks, it's not going to be financially worth it for me, or in terms of public press, I don't want a Standing Rock kind of situation, which is a very, cynical approach to things, but I think that that's maybe sort of the outcome. So I think for as devastating as both of those situations are, I think they're massive turning points, and I think much in the same way that Pontiac's War, you can look at that and say that's the crumbling of all of these things, or you can look at that and say, this is a kind of monumental turning point. This is pan-Indigenous, resistance. This is a new kind of set of alliances. So asking about the resonance of Standing Rock in Canada and whether this is new and what's happening with that, I'm not sure I can fully answer this question, but I think that some of this, for especially nations that are along the U.S. and Canada border, like the Six Nations, like the Cree, those people have worked across the border for a very, very, very long time. And I think what was really interesting for me was Idle No More had a very limited resonance within the U.S. Major cities, there were demonstrations, but if I talk about Idle No More in the States, there's a good chance that whoever I'm talking to has never heard of this. And I think social media was huge. I really think that the stereotypes and the fact that it was the Sioux as opposed to any other group, because there's groups across the states who have been dealing with resource extraction, egregious, exploitation by corporations and the federal government. And I think something about our popular and public imagery of Plains people on horseback and war bonnets and our love for westerns and Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, I think that just has national carry and purchase in a way that a lot of other Indigenous people already have layers of invisibility where they have to first fight to be seen as Native people, and then you have to explain the issue, and then you have to, mobilize support. Whereas here there was none of that question of, are these really Indigenous people? Do they have real rights to the Plains? Are these in the US, are these the real Indians? So I think some of that explains sort of the resonance, but I really do think that and I think especially Indigenous environmental movements and post-Keystone XL, which for me was really the first transnational powerful alliance. I'm hoping we're going to see more of that going forward, but yeah, I think you're right. I think this is a transition and a turning point in terms of alliances.